Mabuhay. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. That's a Filipino greeting, Mabuhay, thanks to one of our Philippine listeners, Denise, because we're back in the Philippines today. We're back with the crew of the Signet. And just in case you happen to be new to the show or would like a quick refresher, here goes as fast as possible. Signet was a merchantman out of London, owned by a trading firm. Charles Swan was a fat, jovial captain tasked with taking Signet to Peru, where he would trade with the Spanish there. Signet, though, got caught up with a bunch of English pirates who were menacing Peru and Panama on what they called the Second Pacific Adventure. Swan was forced to scuttle his plans for trade, as the Spanish there would have killed any Englishmen they found after 2 or 3 pirate raids. So Swan agreed to engage in a little light piracy. But after a few months, he decided to split with his pirate comrades. Those pirates were crossing back to the Caribbean, and Swan chose instead to sail across the Pacific to the East Indies. The crew agreed, although some did choose to go with the pirates. But that's when William Dampier joined the crew of Signet. Dampier was a naturalist and a navigator who wrote and published his experiences on this voyage, and he's who we have to thank for most of this story. After a dreadful Pacific crossing, they arrived at the Marianas Islands, and then moved on to Guam and finally landed at the southernmost Philippine island of Mindanao. They made landfall, eventually, at the Sultanate of Mindanao. The Sultan there produced a letter from the English East India Company to the Sultan that outlined a plan to build a factory there on Mindanao. They hoped that Swan was a representative of the company, but he wasn't. Swan was honest about that and broke the news to the Sultan. Still, though, the Sultan's brother, a man named Raja Laut, who was the admiral of the Sultanate, was trying to talk Captain Swan and the crew of Signet into staying there at Mindanao. The crew numbered around 100 men, and we could break them into 3 factions. First, the captain's faction. That included, obviously, Captain Swan, as well as his first mate, Mr. Nelly, the factor, Mr. Harthop, and the merchant, Mr. Smith, along with around 30 others. One might include the captain of their bark, their smaller companion ship named Captain Josiah Teat, with the captain's faction, for now. And then there was what one might call the sensible faction. That included William Dampier and the quartermaster of Signet, Mr. Henry Moore, as well as probably a Mr. Carl Roffey, who would, later on, go on to become a captain in the Royal Navy. And then I would add the surgeon's mate, Herman Coppinger, and perhaps the surgeon himself. But then third, there was the pirate faction. Old sea dogs who plundered the coasts of Peru and Panama back in the Pacific Adventure, but they had agreed to the plan of selling the wares on board Signet to buy spices there in the East Indies. They agreed to that plan months ago, but more and more they seemed to be pushing to ride out and to scour the sea near the Spanish capital of the Philippines at Manila. The pirate faction was led by John Reed, the ship's pilot. He was a gruff, experienced seaman. I have suggested that it's possible, however very unlikely, that John Reed was the disappeared and presumed dead father of Mary Reed. The pirate faction was small at first. Most of them belonged to the sensible faction, but they were growing. It looked very much like Captain Swan was seriously considering Raja Laut's plan to settle down there at Mindanao, and for a crew that was used to a life of roving, that was less than ideal. They were, at the moment, speaking quietly, in hushed whispers, in secluded corners. This is episode 131, A Seaman Bred. Over the last few weeks, we have discussed the establishment and the early years of the Dutch and English East India Companies, the VOC and EIC respectively, and here in the fall of 1686, the Sultanate of Mindanao, and therefore the crew of the Signet, were surrounded by company power. To the south, the Dutch controlled the Spice Islands and much of Indonesia. They had bases on Sumatra and Java and a powerful naval base at Jakarta. They also had a presence to the north, at Taiwan and even in Japan. To the west there was Borneo and mainland Southeast Asia. Now, that was mostly independent from company power, but the English were sniffing around, and then further to the west there was India, which had a substantial English presence. But a more immediate threat than the English or even the Dutch was the Spanish Empire. Their westernmost expanse of Nueva España was the Philippines. However, all three powers, the Dutch, English, and Spanish, would view Signet and her crew as a threat. The Dutch and Spanish would view her as interlopers in their vital colonial trade system, and both were notorious for dealing with interlopers, that is, anyone who chose to trade without license, harshly. And the English would see the crew for what they were, pirates. Maybe Captain Swan's credentials would carry water, and maybe he could spin a yarn of being commandeered by pirates and forced to flee and cross the Pacific, or maybe not. He didn't know, and it was best at this point not to test that. The best bet for the Signet was to stay in waters and ports that were held by independent nations. Mindanao, Vietnam, the Malacca Sultanate in Malaysia, and Thailand. All of them were relatively safe ports from which they could undertake the plan. Swan's old plan to buy nutmeg and cinnamon, to buy it out from under the Dutch noses, to do so with the proceeds from their attack on the Panamanian gold mine at Santa Maria. With that sort of cargo, a haul that valuable, they just might be able to avoid the gallows and enrich everyone on the crew. And that was still the plan, right? Ostensibly, yes, no new plan had been brought before the crew, but Captain Charles Swan did seem to be seriously entertaining the proposals of Raja Laut. That would include setting up a factory at the capital of Mindanao, which would encroach on both Spanish and Dutch interests. But it wasn't just Raja Laut that wanted to make this a reality. The people of Mindanao appear to have wanted it as well. Dampier tells us in his book, A New Voyage Round the World, quote, "They are most afraid of the Dutch, being sensible how they have enslaved many of the neighboring islands. For that reason they have a long time desired the English to settle among them, and have offered a convenient place to build a fort in. They do not find the English so encroaching as the Dutch or Spanish." End quote. And, well, think about it. If they got this English merchant, with his crew of around 100 men, to build and man a fort, to supply it with their 26 big guns, to teach the shipwrights to build European-style sloops, the people of Mindanao might just have a chance of defending their kingdom against either the Dutch or the Spanish. And it's entirely likely that Raja Laut had their number here. He might know just what these bearded, raggedy swashbucklers were all about. They were pirates. And Raja Laut knew pirates. There were a ton of Malay pirates operating in a nearby island chain. But they were less experienced with capturing European-style vessels. They did so, but only smaller craft. These English pirates had that experience, though. They could lead crews of Moro sailors to capture ships, to train the crew, and eventually to build a navy. All of this reminds me very much of Barbarossa, of Redbeard in the Mediterranean, an Ottoman Greek privateer who had the experience to lead fleets, to build shipyards and gunpowder factories and cannon foundries, all of which would construct a navy. Raja Laut wanted this very badly. He was courting Captain Swan as assiduously as any amorous youth would court a lover, and he was treating Swan and his inner circle of Harthop, Smith, and Nellie to the good life. They were staying in Raja Laut's home. They dined together every evening, and they shared bois and tea and tobacco. But what else were they sharing? The crew was certainly asking that question. Women, certainly, and Raja Laut was well known to have the prettiest servants and harem girls and daughters. How far would Raja Laut go, the crew wondered. But the women weren't the biggest source of gossip among the crew. More than anything else, they talked about the money. See, Swan and Harthop and Smith had a chest full of gold for the ship's seed money. The crew had agreed to take smaller shares, to pitch into this seed money, and then to sail across the Pacific in the understanding that they would take all of that money and buy spices with it. It was to be an investment in their future, an investment in the plan. Now you may remember that Captain Swan had agreed to shelter the signet in a river there in Mindanao. Monsoon season was upon them, and that seemed to be the safest place for their ship. And you may also remember that Raja Laut personally stood on deck to pilot signet in himself. He knew the river, after all, so that makes sense as well. But then Captain Swan took that chest of money off of the ship. And again, yeah, that makes sense, but it was a little suspicious. That money belonged to the crew. It was to be in the care of Captain Swan and the factor, Mr. Harthop, but right now it was holed up in Raja Laut's estate. The crew were not allowed into the palace where they might get a look at it. At least, well, most of them weren't allowed in. For example, a seaman like John Reed was a bit too uncouth for Raja Laut's company. However, some of the crew did occasionally get to visit Raja Laut's estate. It was the better sort among the crew. Mr. Fitzgerald, the surgeon, his mate Herman Coppinger, Carl Rofe probably, and, one or two others who had a fine suit for dining were sometimes called in to entertain Raja Laut with English song and dance. And, of course, William Dampier. He tells us of the meals that were shared there in the palace. He enjoyed the rice and the fish just fine, but really nothing else that was served there. The buffalo they ate was, quote, prepared nastily, and the fowl they had was, quote, ill-dressed, and he was not terribly fond of the durian fruit. But nonetheless, William Dampier and the other guests sat there and ate these meals with a smile on their faces. Raja Laut was, after all, their host on the island, and Charles Swan was the captain. But more than that, I think, whenever they dined at the palace of Raja Laut, they could get a peek at the treasure, and more than that, to try and decipher what Swan might be planning. After dinner, they would share stories and tea and tobacco and bois, but soon enough they would be off to enjoy their evenings however they saw fit. And their evenings there at Mindanao were pleasant. The crew were ingratiating themselves with the people of Mindanao. They were making friends among the locals and taking lovers, and some were even beginning to set down roots. There was a bit of a language barrier, but many of the women and a few of the men spoke at least a little Spanish, as did many of the crew, so Spanish served as a sort of lingua franca on the island. And most of the men had somewhere to stay there in the capital. They had a host family of sorts. This relationship with the host family was typically initiated by the women of the household, who made themselves available as guides and translators and platonic friends. These women were called Pagalis or Pagali, and it's a custom which amused and occasionally irritated the crew. These relationships were platonic. They were fully condoned by the husbands of the Pagali, and the husbands often called themselves camarada, Spanish for comrade. Dampier writes of this custom, quote, "The citizens of Mindanao came frequently aboard to invite our men to their houses and to offer us Pagalis. It was a long time since any of us had received such friendship, and therefore we were drawn to accept their kindness. In a short time, most of our men got a comrade or two, and as many Pagalis, especially such of us as had good clothes and store of gold, as many had who were of the number of those that accompanied Captain Harris over the Isthmus of Darien, the rest of us being poor enough. Nay, the very poorest and meanest of us could hardly pass the streets, but we were even hauled by force into their houses to be treated by them. Although their treats were but mean, namely tobacco, or betel nut, or a little sweet spiced water, yet their seeming sincerity, simplicity, and the manner of bestowing these gifts made them very acceptable. They would always be praising the English, as declaring that the English and Mindanaeans were all one. This they expressed by putting their 2 forefingers together close and saying, Samo, Samo, that is, all one." End quote. It sounds like a lovely custom, but Dampier goes on to tell us that after telling the English that they were all one, the speaker would move those 2 forefingers apart, about 2 feet, and they would say, "Dutch." And then they would move their fingers as far apart as their arms would stretch and say, "Spanish," indicating, of course, that the people of Mindanao and the English were very much alike in values and sympathies, while the people of the Dutch and Spanish nations were not. And you know, that could just be a clever bit of propaganda, but in this case I don't think it is. The people of the Philippines had very good reason to hate the Spanish and to fear the Dutch. And remember the Hearts and Minds campaign undertaken by the English in Southeast Asia at the dawn of the English East India Company? Well, it appears to have worked. However, the Pagalis were somewhat more nefarious than they appeared at first glance. The men of signet were expected to give gifts to their Pagali, usually baubles or jewelry. The Pagali would gather together to display their gifts in public and admire all of their finery. But these were, of course, merely simple gifts of friendship, absolutely nothing more. But the husband would accept no payment for the food and the shelter he provided, as long as his wife was happy. It's a pleasant fiction, but transactionary at its core. For now, though, through September and October, part of November, everything was mostly happy and peaceful. The men enjoyed the kindness of their hosts, and they spent their evenings in quiet comfort. That was, of course, soon shattered when the truly nefarious nature of the Pagali became apparent. Dampier, I think, noted it first. He was teaching classes, teaching some of the women to speak English, which was a useful skill should the English establish a base here. It was almost exclusively women who spoke other languages, aside from the Arab ruling class, since it was women that oversaw most of the merchant affairs. They had to speak Spanish and Chinese. So the matriarch of the households were usually who was attending Dampier's classes. But then Dampier started noticing that the classes were growing. Pupils of his started bringing their widowed sisters or marriageable daughters. Innocent as can be, but they would introduce them to Dampier, and he was flustered. And I think that Dampier got it first and got some of the worst of that, because his classes were one of the few opportunities that the women of Mindanao had to mingle freely outside of their Pagali relationship. Generally, the men of signet were closely watched in all of their interactions with the women. Raja Laut, for example, claimed that he trusted the crew implicitly and would even show great faith in them by leaving them in private with his wife. However, they were never really in private. There were always one or two large, dangerous-looking men standing around to guard her from harm. Not from the pirates, of course, just a general sort of harm. And Dampier tells us that outside of the Pagali and his classes, he saw women cooped up inside as though they were held prisoner, and he saw at least one woman struck for smiling too forwardly at one of the English. The women who appeared to be forbidden were the topic of much discussion among the crew of Signet. Dampier writes that at one ceremony, when the men of Signet caught a rare glimpse of the royal family, quote, "Two of the Sultan's nieces were about 18 or 19 years old. The other were 3 or 4 years younger. These young ladies were richly dressed with loose garments of silk and small coronets. They were much fairer than any women I did see there, very well featured, and very well proportioned." End quote. And Dampier speaks of the discussions that the men had of an almost mythical Sultan's daughter, a girl only of 14, who the crew had heard tell of but was never once allowed to see. Not even Charles Swan or any of his inner circle got to see her. It appears that the Sultan's daughter was being kept safe for a marriage alliance in the future, and neither the Sultan nor Raja Laut was willing to risk her honor. But the crew did have some consolations in all this. Dampier mentions it only coyly, as he rarely discusses sex in his writings, but there were less platonic relationships forming. A few men, and exactly who these few men were is important, but a few chose to buy a small house there and take a wife, maybe? Maybe a concubine would be a better word. This was a strictly Muslim society, and these concubines never married their English counterparts, but oftentimes they wouldn't come from the Moro people down in Mindanao, but from one of the peoples up in the mountains who were not necessarily Muslim. And even those who didn't choose to buy a house often found someone with whom they could dally and while away the evenings. But even those who didn't find a woman with which to pass the time, and there were several, including William Dampier and Herman Coppinger, the surgeon's mate, once Ramadan was complete, the men of Signet had a great time on Mindanao. They saw traditional dances put on by women and men. They saw the contests of strength and courage and will that were put on by the men of Mindanao. Some of the crew were even so bold as to take part in these contests and laughed at their shortcomings there. Dampier tells us of another custom that was strange and alien to the civilized and highly cultured Europeans. He writes, quote, "You shall always see abundance of people of both sexes in the river from morning till night, washing their bodies or clothes. They strip and stand naked till they have done, then put them on and march out again. Both men and women take great delight in swimming and washing themselves, being bred to it from infancy. I do believe it is very wholesome to wash mornings and evenings in these hot countries, at least 3 or 4 days in the week." End quote. This was a shocking custom for the Englishman, but it was one that Dampier admired and would take up for the rest of his life. Dampier was also present at a mass circumcision, in which the Sultan's son and many of the boys of Mindanao had to prove their manliness in a test of strength before undergoing the procedure. He was impressed at their spirit, but he did note that the young men would walk bow-legged for several days after. All in all, we can imagine a happy, relaxed, pleasant few weeks there at Mindanao. They had friendly hosts and new friends and lovers. They enjoyed good Manila tobacco and the buay nut and even hashish, a transplant from Vietnam. Aside from some of the odd foods and the snakes and centipedes, the men of Signet were at rest. But the weeks dragged into months, and we begin to see the cracks in that peaceful facade. First came those tensions between the crewmen that had money and those that did not. The members of the crew who had money from their raid on Santa Maria were able to procure fine gifts of silver and jewels, while those who had no money had only the cargo on board, silks and dyes and porcelain china, gifts that would have astounded any woman in Europe, but here in the Philippines were commonplace. I mean, imagine having a fierce Filipino woman who is your guide and your host furious at you. You know, you're not her husband, but you feel the full weight of a man made to sleep on the couch, all because you could only afford to give her silk. This forced some of the crew to go back to sleeping on the ship when they could not afford the Pagalis relationship, while still others were barely scraping by, finding gifts for their Pagalis. Of an evening, those men could be seen out by the river, near Signet, huddled around a campfire, eating scant meals. They weren't starving by any means, but not the fare that they would have had in a nice Filipino home. When it rained, the men were forced to take shelter on board, and they began to wonder just what they were doing here. You know, if they had been out on the ocean earning money either by trading for spices or by capturing Spanish prizes, they would be earning a living. But here they were just surviving. And more, John Reed could be seen around those same fires, and all of these dispossessed eyes were locked on him, listening intently to whatever it was he happened to be saying. That pirate contingent I mentioned, this was the nucleus of that group. Aside from John Reed, no one was yet of note here, but that number was going to grow to include officers and even captain's men. I mentioned that we needed to pay attention to exactly who was buying houses and settling down, and those were almost entirely captain's men. They seemed to be settling into very comfortable lives with their new homes and the women they brought in, several of whom seemed to be suspiciously round in key places. And that's all well and good, that's their business, but that state of affairs was unacceptable for men that still needed to work for a living. And then we come to the tale of a man named John Thacker. Thacker was a captain's man, living comfortable enough, and Raja Laut would often request his presence at one of his dinners. John Thacker was an excellent dancer, and the Raja enjoyed his dancing. Dampier writes of him, quote, "Among the men that danced before the general there was one John Thacker, who was a seaman bred. He could neither write nor read, but had formerly learnt to dance in the music houses about Wapping. He came into the South Seas with Captain Harris, and, getting a good quantity of gold and being a good husband of his share, had still some left besides what he laid out in a very good suit of clothes. The general, Raja Laut, supposed by his garb and his dancing that Thacker had been of noble extraction, and to be satisfied of his quality asked one of our men if he did not guess aright of him. The man of whom the general asked this question told him he was much in the right, and that most of our ship's company were of the like extraction, especially those all that had fine clothes. But for the rest, those that had but mean clothes, they were only common seamen. After this, the general showed a great deal of respect to John Thacker, till Captain Swan came to know the business. Undeceiving the general and drubbing the nobleman, he was much incensed against John Thacker, that he could never endure him afterwards, though the poor fellow knew nothing of the matter." End quote. What they're saying here is that one man, John Thacker, due to his clothes and his skill at dancing, impressed Raja Laut as a nobleman. Another crewman, entirely unrelated here, upon being asked if he were in fact a nobleman, said, "Oh yeah, definitely a nobleman. Most of us are, in fact. You can always tell by the clothes." And then Captain Charles Swan, who was always impressed at Raja Laut's many shows of strength through discipline of his men, publicly beat John Thacker in full view of the whole crew. This was not acceptable behavior on board a buccaneer ship. And in the weeks to come, and we're about to enter December 1686, John Thacker found himself at many of the campfires around which men were talking about the captain, talking about their money, and trying to figure out exactly what might be going on here. The fireside chats grew less and less congenial and more conspiratorial. Thacker was only the first man to suffer the discipline of Captain Swan, but more and more members of the crew were subjected to this sort of violence, and they began to join these fires as well. But then the men who were sticking close to Signet noticed something about the ship. The hull was pockmarked and scarred. It was actually the captain of their bark, Captain Josiah Teat, that noticed that damage first and brought it up to Captain Swan. Swan told Josiah Teat not to worry about it, and Josiah Teat promptly ignored him. Teat and John Reed and John Thacker, all three seamen Bred, rallied the crew to see to their vessel. See, John Reed was respected by the men, but he had no official authority, not much at least. However, Captain Teat did. In a way, he was second in command in the fleet. With Teat on board, and now that they had noticed the damage, they had a fully legitimate reason to gather the entire crew together. Those scars and pockmarks on the hull were the work of worms. If left unchecked, they could breach the hull of Signet. Nearly the entire crew, not including Swan and his cadre, went to the river and beached the Signet to careen her. They did so without the permission of Captain Swan or Mr. Harthop or anyone, really, but the damage was significant. However, not all was lost here. See, Signet had two hulls, an inner and an outer hull. This was typical of seafaring vessels after the European design, but it was not typical of the Filipino proa, and that's relevant. Remember here that Raja Laut himself piloted Signet to this very location, where apparently they had a worm problem. That's the sort of thing that one would expect the admiral of a seafaring people to maybe have some information about. The crew was in the middle of peeling off that outer hull when trumpets blared, and suddenly a procession arrived on the scene. Captain Swan arrived with Mr. Smith and Harthop and Nellie and Raja Laut. Raja Laut's reaction here, in front of the whole crew, was shocking. I'll let Dampier tell it. He writes, quote, "We did not mistrust the general's knavery till now, for when he came down to our ship and found us ripping off the sheathing plank and saw the firm bottom underneath, he shook his head and seemed to be discontented, saying he did never see a ship with two bottoms before. We were told that in this place where we now lay, a Dutch ship was eaten up in 2 months' time, and the general had all her guns. It is probable he did expect to have ours, which I do believe was the main reason that made him so forward in assisting us to get our ship into the river, for when we came out again, we had no assistance." End quote. He then goes on to mention the many times that they careened and scrubbed their vessel at the Marianas and Guam, and even on Mindanao before making landfall at Maguindanao. And he says that they never had any trouble with worms before. And then he points out that he had noticed the people of Maguindanao would pull their proa from the river, and if they found any sight of worms, would burn her and dry her until she was ready to go to sea again. After his little temper tantrum, Raja Laut stormed off, but Swan stayed behind. He did so to accost Josiah Teat for going behind his back to careen the ship, but the crew turned on the captain. They asked him, "Do you see the hull sitting there? We had to careen the ship or we would be stranded here forever. Did you see the general's reaction? He was clearly upset and his plans were clearly dashed." Swan backed down, He swore to the crew that he would deal with this situation and confront Raja Laut about this information. But Swan was a coward. He would never do so. Instead, once the ship was repaired and back in the harbor at anchor, Swan decided to reassert his authority among the crew. Swan had beaten John Thacker and several other members of the crew, but once the signet was back in the water at anchor, Captain Swan had Josiah Teat dragged out into the center of town. There, before Raja Laut and several of the other members of the royal family, and a growing number of people from the town, and the entire crew of Signet, Swan had him strapped down and beaten with a whip. Dampier says that at that time, Captain Swan had his men as much under command as if he had been in a king's ship. The men were furious, but they didn't react immediately. They watched this effrontery in silence and then walked away without a single word to their captain. This wasn't the last straw. There were 2 or 3 more straws that had to break, and we're going to discuss those next time. But at this point, I think that the tide had turned against Captain Charles Swan irrevocably. Now that John Thacker and John Reed and Josiah Teat had the ship seaworthy, and now that the crew had seen just the depths to which their captain would sink, beating his second-in-command in front of the entire city, they began to prepare for departure, under the nose of Captain Swan, or maybe just not caring if he saw. And these 3 men, among others, began to secure their position on the signet, which they would soon be running. When we left off, things were tense among the crew of Signet on the island of Mindanao. Through November and early December 1686, Captain Charles Swan was growing increasingly authoritarian and violent with the crew, and that's kind of a bad look for a crew full of buccaneers. Additionally, Captain Charles Swan, the factor, Mr. Harthop, and the merchant, Mr. Smith, appeared to be very much in league with Raja Laut, the military leader there at Maguindanao. They lived with Raja Laut, they ate with him every night, and Swan was unwilling to confront him. You'll remember that bit of drama surrounding Raja Laut piloting Signet into a worm-infested bit of river, apparently in a bid to claim her guns and her crew for his own military purposes. Swan was supposed to have had it out with Raja Laut after that little incident, but instead he had the captain of his own bark, Josiah Teat, whipped in a bid to reinforce his own power. Raja Laut was, at this point in the minds of the crew of Signet, a great villain. He was assumed to be scheming against the crew. Aside from that little plot with the worms, he currently had all of their seed money holed up inside his palace. It was seen as a sort of sneaky, dishonest backstabbing. Now, dishonest backstabbing is something we can respect here on the Pirate History podcast, but the thing is, Raja Laut wasn't very good at it. He was a military man. He was a devout Muslim, although not very good at that either, and an aristocrat. Dishonest backstabbing was not his forte, especially not when he was attempting to do it against a bunch of masters of the craft. That's why Josiah Teat and John Reed brought Signet out into the harbor of Mindanao and stationed a guard aboard. They saw exactly what Raja Laut was up to and wanted to keep their lines of escape open in case of treachery or sabotage on the part of the people of Maguindanao. And I'd like to take this point to remind you of the 3 factions in Mindanao among the crew of Signet. There was the Loyalist faction, all of them Swan's men, and they were the smallest faction among the crew. Then there was the Sensible faction, which was by far the largest. Those were the members who advocated for leaving Mindanao under Captain Charles Swan to trade for spices in the Spice Islands and return home, everybody rich men. And then we have the pirate faction, who advocated for, piracy. They were all for attacking Spanish ships and getting rich and getting drunk and not really thinking much past today. And I could explain their plan in more depth, but that would be giving the story away. Because, spoilers, the pirate faction is going to win. This is episode 132, General Rogueries. Now all of that is very dramatic stuff, but it's grounded in a real-world concern. The late fall and early winter of 1686 was the height of the westerly monsoon. These were the winds that could carry the pirates deeper into the Indies, and in reality they were the only winds that could carry them home. The longer that Captain Swan sat idly by, the more and more nervous grew the members of his crew who eventually wanted to go home. And then what with Swan's policy, i.e. the beatings will continue until morale improves, and these very real concerns about getting underway before the winds shifted out of favor, it was impossible to stay neutral in this argument. The vast majority of the crew after only a couple of weeks here was against Swan, but there were still key differences between the sensible faction and the pirate faction. We could look at it kind of like a primary in an election. You have the sensible faction, who are the moderates, or maybe the centrists. They weren't yet ready to turn to outright piracy. Instead, they wanted to stick to the plan and to stay right with the law. But more and more, they seemed to be adopting policies of the pirate faction. Namely, they were warming to the idea of deposing Captain Swan. They realized that he was not the candidate to lead them toward their plan. Instead, they chose Captain Josiah Teat of the bark, a man who had been publicly beaten by Swan, to be the new captain. And then we have the pirates and their candidate, John Reed. Reed was an extremist, a radical in this election, if you will. A pirate radical, a pie radical, maybe. Now that group of the crew, the pirate faction, was smaller than the moderates, but they were looking more and more attractive to those among the moderate faction who wanted to eventually get home and hopefully earn some money on this years-long voyage. But there were a few among the crew who chose not to side with any of the factions. There were a few, maybe as many as a dozen, but probably closer to 8, who fled into the highlands of Mindanao. Some of those took a woman with them, usually from among the lowest class in Mindanao, who were Moro women but not Muslim women, not members of the Mindanao Sultanate. Dampier suggests that they may have had help from Raja Laut to enact their escape, and it's entirely possible they did. But we can wish them happy lives among the mountain people of Mindanao that were long and full of many wonderful children. However, those who left disappeared from this story and from history. There were a few among the crew who had families back in England that they hoped someday to see again. For those among the crew, Swan's plan of staying in Mindanao would not work. The pirates' plan of fighting for Spanish plunder would not work, and the idea of fleeing into the hills was unacceptable. And for a few of these who didn't think that the moderates were ever going to win this debate and wind up buying spices and returning to England happy and healthy merchants, well, they bought a canoe. A seafaring canoe, and they were preparing that canoe to make for India and an English port, hopefully, where they could book passage home. But Captain Swan caught wind of this little plot and correctly surmised that these men would very likely notify the East India Company of his presence at Mindanao, and that would very likely displease the company. So Swan took their canoe by force. He burned it, and he had the men beaten. That little group, after their bruises healed, bought another canoe but Swan found that one as well. Regardless of all of that, regardless of which faction they might belong to, the majority of the crew of Signet was preparing to leave. They were readying the ship, they were supplying her with victuals, they had plenty of rice and water, but they still needed meat. They had previously cut a deal with Raja Laut to trade him iron for some beef that they could salt and preserve to take with them. Now the crew had already come through on their end. They provided the iron to Raja Laut, but Raja Laut had not yet produced any beef. He had a hunting expedition planned that included himself and his household and a few skilled hunters, ringers on the team, and 6 men of the Signet. That party included Captain Swan, Mr. Harthop, Mr. Smith, a couple of other sycophants, and William Dampier. Now Dampier spends his narrative largely gushing about the proa they took, which was a pleasure barge, and the opulence he saw on board Raja Laut's proa, the comforts that were afforded them, including food and drugs, and the many women that Raja Laut brought with him. Then he writes, quote, "One of the general's servants had offended and was punished. He was bound fast, flat on his belly to the prow, which was so near the water that by the vessel's motion it frequently delved under water, and the man along with it. And sometimes when hoisted up he had scarce time to blow before he would be carried under water again." End quote. This was all great fun for Raja Laut and his company, but the English, even those who were fully in Raja Laut's pocket, were visually disturbed. But that evening they had a feast, and the women danced enticing dances, and were led to believe that not a man among the hunting party went to bed alone. Dampier writes, quote, "There were 5 or 6 more of our company with me, young men who had Delilahs there, which made them very fond of the place." End quote. And over the next several days their evenings involved feasting and dancing and dallying with Delilahs. But during the daytime they hunted. That was, after all, what they were here to do. That is to say that they dragged themselves out of bed sometime around noon, had a big breakfast, and tramped around on the grassland hillsides for about 2 hours, laughing and conversing and drinking rice wine, which, of course, they weren't allowed to do in town. And then they went back to their lodge and cavorted until everyone was sated with food and drink and bois and hashish and kava and women, and then they passed out. Now, all of that sounds like great fun. In fact, I'm personally hard-pressed to name a better way to spend a long weekend, but that also means that they failed to find even a single buffalo or deer, let alone to kill one. Raja Laut may have been showing these men a great time, but he was failing to hold up his end of the bargain, and that means that the crew might very likely starve to death. So while most of the Englishmen were enjoying themselves, in the wake of that disappointment, some of the tension between Charles Swan and Raja Laut bubbled up. One evening they broke out into an argument, which Dampier overheard, and what he learned there shocked him, but it did not shock Mr. Harthop or Mr. Smith. Charles Swan had, previously to this argument, loaned a great deal of money to Raja Laut, 20 ounces of gold, in fact. Today, 20 ounces of gold would be worth $30,000, more or less. If we were to adjust that for inflation, we would get $1.8 million. And that's a lot of money. But if we assume, using East India Company metrics of the time, that one could quadruple one's money by trading in nutmeg and cinnamon, we would get a net loss of around $7 million of Signet's money. $7 million that Raja Laut loudly and forcefully during this argument in hearing of Dampier declared not to be a loan, but a gift from Charles Swan. Then Raja Laut demanded that if Swan was determined to leave Mindanao, he had to first pay for the food he and his friends ate at Raja Laut's table. Only then would Raja Laut produce the beef he owed. This was disturbing stuff. Stuff that might have suggested to Dampier that they might never be allowed to leave Mindanao. At least, not with Captain Swan or their money. Mr. Harthop and Mr. Smith, upon the close of the argument, told Dampier to keep quiet about what he had heard. That's how they were going to keep order among the crew, after all. And Dampier agreed to that, but Dampier was lying. He told John Reed and all the rest about this turn of events. He gave them all of the information. He told them that Swan was not in Raja Laut's pocket, but he was being extorted to stay, and he was unlikely to willingly leave Mindanao, as was their money. The crew was incensed. They planned to confront Captain Swan at the very next opportunity and demand that they forcefully take back their money and leave this place. But that opportunity didn't come until Christmas, 1686. The whole crew, though, on Christmas Day, was set to meet aboard the Signet, and this was the first time they'd been together in months' time. But Swan, as was to be expected, arrived late to the festivities. He refused to hear any complaints, and he left early. This was the last opportunity that Captain Swan had, in my opinion. He, on Christmas Day, 1686, lost his captaincy of the ship. By failing to take any of his men's concerns into account, he lost his right to lead them. The following 2 weeks would grow increasingly tense. There were fights on board. There was open argument with Swan and his men in the streets of Mindanao. Dampier writes, quote, "The whole crew were at this time under a general disaffection, all for want of action. They urged Captain Swan to go to sea. These began to be unruly and sent ashore for rack and honey to make punch, wherewith they grew drunk and quarrelsome." End quote. Dampier tells us that he feared to go aboard as he abhorred drink and quarrelsome behavior. But part of the problem here is that the ship and the crew were ready to go. There were somewhere around 80 men on Mindanao with nothing but idleness and drugs and women to occupy their time. And Dampier talks about the desire for action over and over again, and there's a reason for that. You know, they act as though the monsoon winds are a saving grace, that they're the only hope the crew had of returning home any time this year, and that's true, but it's not the whole story. In fact, if we were to look past Dampier's narrative, that gives us a few telling points of interest. If we think back to well before Dampier and company arrived at Mindanao, on the other side of the ocean, we'll remember the Signet splitting up with the other pirates on the Second Pacific Adventure. They sailed for the coast of Mexico. Now, the reason that we are given was Captain Swan's desire to trade in East Indian spices, and that's an activity that he was really busy not doing here in late 1686 and early 1687. Swan was resting on his laurels while order crumbled in his crew. But there is another possible reason, a reason which we were not given. The Manila galleons. The treasure ships that crossed the Pacific from Philippine Nueva España to Mexican Nueva España and back again. Now, we know today that these galleons didn't often make landfall in Mexico. Instead, they sailed for Panama. And while the pirates back in 1685 knew about the treasure galleons in Panama, they couldn't be sure that there wasn't some port at which the Spanish unloaded untold riches there in Mexico. The English were almost totally ignorant of the Pacific coast of America. Outside of the voyages of Drake and Cavendish, they knew barely anything. They weren't even sure at this point if Baja was an island or a peninsula, until Dampier confirmed that the Californian lake, separating Baja from mainland Mexico, did not travel all the way through. It's possible that the crew was trying to catch and capture an extraordinarily rich prize upon her arrival to Mexico. One of the treasure ships far before she ever would have reached Panama at her first dock in the New World. Now, they failed at that because there were no ships to capture, but they did gain some insight on that voyage. The English took several Spanish captives there in Mexico, and we're going to talk a lot more about them next time, but for now, they did have news of a Manila galleon that had just set out to cross the Pacific Ocean. We can envision a story in which their sudden and underprepared passage across the Pacific Ocean was in chase of just such a ship that, you might remember, they found upon their arrival at the island of Guam. Only, upon their arrival at Guam, Swan lost his nerve. Quote, "Our men were in a great heat to go out after her, but Captain Swan persuaded them out of that humor, for he was now wholly averse to any hostile action." End quote. But now, almost a year later, the monsoon was shifting so that the Signet and that same Manila galleon could travel west. The crew had been sitting idly by for months now, but if they were going to catch that ship, this was the time. Again, Dampier dances around that possibility. He tells us the crew was eager for action, but not what action. And we'll be looking into all that as well next time. For now, we need to look at the other reasons that the crew was growing agitated and turning to unruly drunkenness there on Mindanao. And I do want to note that even at this late stage, the crew was still undivided on how to treat Captain Swan. The pirates among the crew were prepared to leave him, or kill him if need be, and go out a-roving. And that decision would see the crew of Signet labeled Hostis Humani Generis, enemies of the whole human race, by the standards of their own government and every government in the world, pirates. The moderate faction were still of the opinion that even if they voted Captain Swan out of power, which they at this point wanted to do, they still needed to take him along. They could trade for spices, as was the original plan, or, in the wake of new information that they had just received, they could sail out as privateers. But to accomplish either of those goals, they needed their legally appointed captain safe and sound. And that particular question is going to jump to the forefront of our story very soon, but not yet. Because while the crew was busy drinking and debating, two things happened that hastened their departure. First, there were the deaths. Sudden, suspicious illnesses that were followed by painful death, and several of them in quick succession. The surgeon's mate, Herman Coppinger, examined the bodies and found the livers to be shriveled and dry. Now, there are a few possible causes here. It's possible that they were simple tropical diseases, a few of which match those symptoms. However, we would think that the surgeon or Dampier would note that. It could be that these deaths were caused by toxins that were willingly ingested that affect the liver. Why, which they were enjoying, kava, and kratom are all intoxicants that will make you feel good and that negatively impact liver health. All three of these are Southeast Asian in origin and were commonly used there in Mindanao and in Islamic societies all over the region that frowned upon alcohol. Of course, the doses have to be exceptionally high, and to kill someone it takes a long time. Of course, the pirates were exactly the sort of people that would have enjoyed them to excess, but to imagine 7 or 8 men in a week's time dying, well, that stretches the imagination to the breaking. And neither tropical disease nor drug use was what jumped to the forefront of the pirates' minds. They thought what I imagine you are thinking: poison. That's what Herman Coppinger and William Dampier believed. That's what John Reed and Josiah Teat believed. That's what nearly everyone among the crew believed. And what made those deaths even more suspicious was that they all seemed to come from the pirate faction. The faction that was arguing most vociferously to leave. Raja Laut had plenty of good reason to poison the pirates among the crew, and the crew assumed that he was to blame. And there is a ton of circumstantial evidence to suggest that if the pirates were in fact poisoned, Raja Laut was ultimately the culprit. We can't rule him out here, but we can't place blame too quickly either. Plenty of others on Mindanao had good reason to kill pirates as well. Remember that order was breaking down among the crew, and when order breaks down among a crew of pirates, that doesn't bode well for anyone in their general vicinity. They were growing more riotous and more obstinate and more villainous. Dampier doesn't give a lot of details here, but we can imagine the fights and the outright thefts and the sexual excess. Dampier writes, quote, "The natives are very expert at poisoning and do it upon small occasions, nor did our men want for giving offense through their general rogueries, and sometimes by dallying too familiarly with their women, even before their faces." End quote. Dampier's not talking about Pagalis or concubines that some of the crew had procured. He's talking about pirates seducing the wives and daughters of those same locals. But what he doesn't talk about, and what very likely took place as well, were some pretty horrific scenes of sexual violence. We're talking armed bands of angry pirates roaming the streets and looking for victims. Anyone who tried to stop them, brutally beaten or killed. Now, in many older chivalric or chauvinistic cultures, poison is often considered a woman's weapon. We should not ignore the possibility that it wasn't Raja Laut nor cuckolded husbands that poisoned the pirates, but the women of Mindanao, victims and victims' mothers and sisters that poisoned the pirates in their search for revenge. Now, all of that violence and debauch was the sort of thing that the general of Mindanao, Raja Laut, could have put an end to almost immediately with his force of arms. He had an army. That's the reason that the pirates weren't able to storm his palace and take their money back. But that would have ended in a skirmish that would have likely ended in a battle, and that would eventually have chased off Signet and the rest of her crew. Swan also could have stopped this sort of excess, at least according to Dampier, who writes, quote, "What designs Swan had I know not, for he was commonly very cross. I am confident if he had made a motion to go to any English factory, most of his men would have consented to it. His authority might have overswayed those that were refractory, for it was very strange to see the awe that these men were in of him, though he punished the most stubborn and daring of his men." End quote. But Swan sat idle and recalcitrant. He did nothing. Dampier continues, quote, "These disorders might have been crushed if Captain Swan had used his authority to suppress them. But he, with his merchants living always ashore, there was no command. And therefore every man did what he pleased and encouraged each other in his villainies." End quote. Now, we shouldn't assume that Swan's lackeys were not aware of this state of affairs. Mr. Harthop, the factor, was very aware. He begged Captain Swan to go to the ship and to address the men, to tell them what his plans were and to assure them that they had something to look forward to. But Swan refused. And at this point, something interesting happened. Harthop pulled rank on Captain Swan. Remember that Captain Charles Swan had absolute authority, in theory, while on board, but Harthop represented the investors in this venture. That is to say, he was the representative of Swan's bosses. So Charles Swan agreed to address the men and called them all to be aboard on the Signet on the 13th of January, 1687. This was it. This was the moment that Swan had the opportunity to gain his authority back and to travel out as captain of a successful merchant voyage to the East Indies. And the crew was willing to hear him. They gathered on board slowly until nearly everyone was on board 2 days aforetime on the 11th of January. and with nearly the entire crew on board, the other shoe dropped. I'm curious as to whether any of what follows actually happened as we are told it happened. It rings to me of conspiracy. John Reed, the leader of the pirate faction, who I have suggested may possibly, although unlikely, be the father of Mary Reed, and I should note his name is spelled R-E-A-D, John Reed went a snooping in the captain's quarters. Dampier mentions at this point that John Reed was a man of letters and something of an artist. John Reed found in Captain Swan's quarters a journal from his time on the Pacific Ocean with the crew. You may remember Captain Swan jovially slapping the frail Dampier on the back and declaiming upon their having spotted land, quote, "Ah, Dampier, you would have made them but a poor meal," end quote. And that's a fun sort of jape when you know you're safe and not going to be eaten. But apparently, according to this journal, Captain Swan was much more concerned about that sort of thing than his jokes suggested. And who can blame him here? I mean, he's on a solitary ship, hundreds of leagues from civilization or even land, with a crew of killers that was looking lean and hungry. I imagine any of us would grow a bit concerned. But whispers of threats to eat him reached his ears there on the signet, and they appear to have... Well, if the journal that John Reed produced here is to be believed, those weeks in the Pacific drove Captain Charles Swan insane. He details his fear and hatred of certain crewmen and the abuses that he would have enjoyed inflicting upon them if only he could without those madmen turning to cannibalism. He disparages their loyalty to himself and to England, he insults their honor, and he even denies their courage. And then, and this is the truly damning part, he outlines his plans to remove certain members of the crew who weren't pulling their weight. How to have them killed in such a fashion that it would look like an accident. I mean, he suggests having certain important lines weakened and almost snapped, and then sending those crewmen up to work them where they would fall to their death. And once that crewman happens to be dead, well, meat's back on the menu, boys. And of course, Captain Swan is blameless in all of this. However, I find this a bit questionable, largely because some of the men that Swan targeted in his journal were influential leaders of the Sensible faction. One of them, a popular gunner from Jamaica named, confusingly, John Reed, only spelled R-E-E-D, was targeted especially hard. Josiah Teat and a host of others on the fence were targeted as well. But what we're expected to believe here is that John Reed, R-E-A-D, the leader of the pirate faction, an artist who knew how to read and write, Dampier tells us, stumbled across this journal while no one else was with him that detailed Captain Swan's plan to kill and eat the very members of the crew who were arguing to keep Captain Swan alive. Is that possible? Certainly it is. Is it probable? No. It stretches the imagination. Did John Reed instead forge those diary entries? Well, Dampier doesn't come right out and say, and I wasn't there. But he does, Dampier, leave a trail of breadcrumbs in his manuscript that leads us to that conclusion. So while he doesn't argue one point or another, he seems to very strongly suggest that. Some of the crewmen, many of those who had been so targeted by Captain Swan, who were led by John Reed, the R-E-E-D Reed from Jamaica, went wild. They rowed ashore and had their way with the inhabitants of Mindanao. It wasn't a pirate raid. There, first of all, weren't enough men. It was only a dozen or so angry drunkards. But they raised quite a ruckus. There was rape and there was pillage. Apparently it was raining at the time, so there was no burning. But they were going mad here, looking for revenge, and if we are to point to a purpose, in their rage, they were trying to draw out Swan and Raja Laut, but they failed to do so. Come dawn, along with the rising sun, they had some fierce hangovers, and the mob slunk back to the signet. The John Reed from England, R-E-A-D, he took control of the situation. He rallied the crew alongside Josiah Teat and fired off the ship's guns. Now, this wasn't a barrage on the city, but it was a message and a warning. They wanted to let them know that they were no longer playing around here. So Mr. Harthop, who seems to have been the only person of any integrity among Swan's cadre, answered the summons. He realized upon arrival at Signet that his authority, the authority of Captain Swan, the authority of the owners of the Signet, had fallen apart. He was no longer in command here. The crew showed him the journal and demanded answers from the captain. Now at this point, no clear leader had been chosen among the crew of Signet. Swan still technically was in command, but while they waited, the crew decided that no matter what Swan was going to say to them, he could not be allowed to remain as captain. He could go with them, but he would not be in command. They chose instead to hold elections for captain and quartermaster and the other primary officers. However, first of all, they had to summon a few notable stragglers from among the crew to take part. There were maybe as many as a dozen men they had to collect, but namely William Dampier and Herman Coppinger, the navigator and the surgeon's mate. Now, Dampier doesn't tell us much about his part in all of this. He certainly plays it down, but he did come willingly once he realized what was happening. Personally, I believe he may have already been ashore, but wanted to remove himself from some of the more illicit actions. Coppinger, on the other hand, was tricked, according to William Dampier. This may or may not be the case, but we're told that those among the crew who went to fetch Herman Coppinger told the doctor that someone on board had broken a leg and needed help. However, they were both made clear on exactly what was happening as soon as they were aboard and took part in the election. And that election was, of course, between John Reed and Josiah Teat, the leader of the pirate faction against the leader of the moderate faction. And, as I mentioned earlier, and as we will explore next time, there were opportunities for legal privateering in the region, opportunities the crew knew about, and Teat absolutely would have led the crew in that direction. Reed, on the other hand, was arguing for raids against the Spanish, and as England and Spain were currently at peace, that was piracy. So, in a way, this election was a referendum between privateering and piracy. In a more symbolic way, this election is a representation of the sea change taking place in our story at this moment. Thus far, with a few notable exceptions, most of the rovers about whom we have spoken have been privateers, agents of the crown that were awarded letters of marque from King Louis or King Charles or the Prince of Orange or one of their agents. Now that line between pirate and privateer has grown excessively thin and disputed by rival powers, but nearly everyone we've spoken of, from Barbarossa and Francis Drake on down to Morgan and the French buccaneers, they all had that piece of paper. Even if that piece of paper was years out of date from a governor and a monarch who were no longer in power, it was a shield, a flimsy shield certainly, but still there. Even the crewmen of this ship, back on the coast of South America when they were engaging in what could only be called piracy, they sailed with a privateer who had a letter of marque. Now, that piece of paper came from a foreign French governor, which was illegal under English law. That governor had also, long before they were raiding on the coast of South America, been ousted from power on Saint-Domingue, and that made it all the more invalid and illegal. But the crew of Signet could still hide behind that piece of paper, and if they brought in the goods, they just might win that argument. And at this point, they had no piece of privateering paper. They had no letter of marque, no letter of reprisal. However, they could get one. Over in India right now, They knew that they could get a letter of marque from the East India Company allowing them to go out and commit acts of piracy legally, but they would be limited in their targets. They would not be allowed to attack the Spanish or the Dutch, and if they chose instead to turn pirate, they could attack whoever they chose. In the end, the vote was close, but the crew elected John Reed and Piracy. Dampier doesn't tell us how he voted, but he does write that the crew was still willing to take former Captain Swan along if he chose to leave Mindanao with them. And he even opines that at this late stage, quote, if Captain Swan had yet come aboard, he might have dashed all their designs, but he neither came himself, as a captain of any prudence and courage would have done, nor sent till the time was expired. So we left Captain Swan and about 36 men ashore, and about 16 we had buried there, the most of which died by poison. End quote. The crew of Signet the official crew of Signet numbered around 80 men, but the Signet carried more than that. A few, probably foolish, Englishmen brought their women with them on board, and they also had a number of captives from Mexico and Spain and the Philippines that were not counted in the official crew. We're going to be talking about them next time. For now, though, the crew sailed out of Mindanao Harbor on the 14th of January, 1687, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Before them lay the open ocean, and all of them had plunder on their minds. Today's episode is confusing. It's confused. It's all jumbled up, largely because the people who were telling this tale originally did the jumbling. I'd like you to imagine a book entitled something like Memoirs of a Mobster. That's the kind of title that really moves units, might even have been handed down by the publisher. In fact, a book like that might already exist even. But imagine when you open up Memoirs of a Mobster and begin to read, you realize the title is inaccurate. It should really have been titled Memoirs of a Man that happens to come from a mob family who hangs out exclusively with mobsters and is intimately familiar with Tommy guns and bootleg liquor, but definitely not in the mob. Would you trust anything in that book? Would you trust alleged criminal, to tell the truth about his or her criminality? That's a problem with which we have to wrestle here in our discussion of pirates and piracy. The subject is crime. Whatever other themes we might explore, it's a show about criminals. And criminals that operated far from civilization. We have records of some of their actions in legal records from England and Spain and France, and some of that's great, and it certainly helps verify the story, but it's not really a narrative. For something like that, we need to look to our primary sources: Alexander Exquemelin, William Dampier, Raveneau de Lussan, all of whom are pirates. Except, of course, William Dampier wasn't a pirate. He just happened to sail exclusively on pirate ships alongside the most notorious buccaneers of his day, all of which is simple happenstance. Definitely not a pirate. Which begs the question, can we, in good faith, trust anything that William Dampier has to say? Should we take him at his word? Well, we can trust him on some things. His descriptions of people and places and flora and fauna and winds and tides, the real meat of his book. At least we can trust him to be honest in that, if not necessarily accurate. He was certainly biased and a product of the 1600s, but he's telling what he views as the truth there. However, could we trust him to be honest about the piratical actions in which he took part? And the answer to that is complicated, but today we'll get to examine that very question, as we have a few new sources from which to draw. And that relieves me, personally. not only do we have a second primary source narrative, we have a wealth of excellent scholarly research, and we have testimony taken from pirates who were there alongside contemporary legal analysis. That's a lot to draw upon. That's more than we've had to draw upon at almost any point in our show, excepting maybe the sack of Panama by Henry Morgan. Because as the crew of Signet turned to piracy, suddenly they became the focus of nearly every authority in the East Indies. This is episode 133. Our business was to pillage. I'm going to begin by jumping forward a few years, to the year 1690, a little over 3 years after our story today. The location is back in the Western Hemisphere, in the West Indies, in fact, on the coast of the Yucatan, in a lightly populated Spanish encomienda. I'd like you to imagine that you are the local governor there, not just of that encomienda, but of several in the region, and word reaches your desk of a shipwreck on the Caribbean coast of the peninsula under a Spanish captain. Now, none of that is noteworthy, except that the ship that wrecked was a Spanish East Indiaman. Now, that is interesting. A ship that rightly belonged in the Pacific on the opposite side of the continent from you, and then you hear about the cargo on board. There was some porcelain china, some ivory, a bit of indigo, but much more noteworthy and in larger quantities was a wealth in iron and bronze and tin. All of that, your agents assure you, came from Asia, and some of it carries the imprint of the English East India Company. Now, here in 1690, England and Spain were allies in a war against France. Not friends exactly, but working together to halt King Louis in his march across Europe. Now, here you have this Spanish vessel, far from her home port, carrying English goods that clearly belonged to the English East India Company. The right thing to do, in your shoes, would have been arresting the crew, confiscating the cargo, and sending all of that lovely metal to the nearest English colony, in this case, Jamaica. There it could be picked up by the company, and you could wash your hands of the entire ordeal. But then again, Spain was at war with France at the moment, and it was shaping up to be a very hot war. Materials like iron and bronze and tin were tough to come by in the empire, and very expensive. A ship this full of the stuff could equip your own ships with guns and sabers, and all of the armaments necessary to sail on over to Santo Domingo and oust the French dogs occupying half the island. Not only was that good for the war effort, that would be good for your own personal honor and glory. So what would you do with that haul of necessary war materials? Would you hand it off to the English, who would then win the honor and glory, and then once the war was over were likely as not to turn it on you? Or would you commandeer those metals for the good of Spain? And if, in doing so, you had to fudge a few of the details, well, it's all for the greater good. Now, I don't know what you would do in that situation, but I'll give the ending away here just a bit. The governor in question chose the latter option. He took those goods for the war effort. It's likely, probable even, that some of this windfall of metal was utilized in the attack against Laut de Graaf and Michael André Zun in the Spanish attack at Cap Francais and La Limonade. The captain of that ship was not arrested. He was given a place to stay and told he was not permitted to leave, then questioned over and over again by various officials until the governor made up his mind here. But then this captain chose, totally on his own, with no government intervention whatsoever or the threat of a prison cell hanging over his head, he chose to write a memoir, or really a confession. It was a full accounting, according to this captain, of the many varied events that led him to the shores of the Yucatan with a ship full of illicit goods. Turns out he was just transporting that ship full of goods to the local authorities, taking that Truck full of bootleg liquor to the sheriff's office. The mob? Nah, he's on the up and up. A real law-abiding citizen. And a good Catholic. And the captain here, indeed his whole crew, well, they're among the Spanish characters we're going to introduce today. Arguably, this captain is the most important Spanish character in this story. However, I'm going to dance around his story a bit, namely his identity, until next time, because, as I think I've made clear here, we can't trust his account. In fact, until quite recently, this source was disregarded as a fiction. However, thanks to the hard work of the Spanish-language linguist Estelle Irizarry and the historian Lopez Lazaro, we can be fairly certain that there is a historical basis for this source, even if he was lying through his teeth the whole time. And he was. But before we get to him, we need to talk about the signet and how these two stories come to intersect. To begin with, let's talk crew. The crew of Signet was revamped but made up mostly of old faces, people that we've met before. John Reed of Bristol served as captain of the Signet, notorious pirate captain now. Josiah Teat, the former captain of the old bark, which they didn't have anymore, was serving as the ship's master. Now, that's what Dampier tells us. Teat was the ship's master, but what does that mean exactly? Usually, in the sailor parlance of the 17th century, a ship's master meant captain, but we know that Teat wasn't the captain. What I think, and what many historians have argued, is that it represented a rank that was unique to late 17th century buccaneer crews, when piracy was exploding all around the world, but many of the traditional forms had not yet been set in stone. On most pirate crews, especially later on, you have the captain and the quartermaster that share power. The captain commanded absolutely in time of battle, but the rest of the time the quartermaster, in theory at least, represented the crew. Oftentimes, though, the quartermaster represented the minority group among the crew. Sometimes the quartermaster would be whoever came in second in the race for captain. And that was a good policy. It ensured that nearly every crewman had someone in a position of power on board that represented their interests. Imagine, the runner-up in a presidential race serving as vice president. It's very much how the ancient Romans chose their consuls. That's the role that Josiah Teat played here, but he wasn't the quartermaster, he was the ship's master. And thus what we think of in the other traditional pirate ranks get pushed down a notch. The quartermaster on board Signet was more of a manager, what usually would have been a boatswain on other ships, and that post was held by Henry Moore, the man who had been the quartermaster this whole time. You might remember him being the first person to go ashore at Mindanao and meet the Sultan. And then we have a few new crewmen to introduce here, people who have been around this whole time but haven't yet become relevant. A man named John Oliver served as boatswain under Henry Moore, the quartermaster. And then there are two others who were just regular crewmen, but they had been part of the sensible faction that voted for Teat, and we're going to need to know their names. The first was Mr. Robert Hall, and the second, well, Dampier doesn't remember his surname, but he was named Ambrose. Those two were friendly with Dampier and the part of the crew that was hesitant about piracy and everything that John Reed represented as captain. And then we have a few other old faces. There's John Thacker, who you may remember as the crewman that Charles Swan publicly beat for wearing fancy clothes, as well as Herman Coppinger, serving as surgeon, and Dampier, again as navigator, and John Reed, that's R-E-E-D, of Jamaica, as master gunner. You'll remember him from last time. So you've got John Reed of Bristol, Josiah Teat, Henry Moore, John Oliver, Robert Hall, Mr. Ambrose, John Thacker, William Dampier, Herman Coppinger, and John Reed of Jamaica. Those are all of the English or Irish names that we need to know for the moment, but we need to mention a few of the non-English sailors that were on board. Dampier occasionally alludes to one or another of these characters, but he rarely gives their name or their rank. However, later testimonies given by members of Signet's crew do a much better job. According to Lopez Lazaro, the first of these was, quote, Bernardo de Uriarte, a 49-year-old vecino, resident or native citizen, of the mining town of San Jose del Cobal, near Guanajuato in Nueva Vizcaya, today's northern Mexico, end quote. Uriarte was captured way back in the winter of 1685 on the Pacific coast of Mexico. Additionally, there was, quote, an Andalusian of Seville by the name of Miguel de Medina, end quote. Now, Miguel was captured in Peru earlier on the Second Pacific Adventure than Uriarte. I say he was captured, but that might not actually be the case. Regardless, though, however he came on board, Miguel took to the rover's life with real gusto and proves to be a central character moving forward. We need to remember Miguel de Medina. Then there was, quote, Marquis Toribio, a black Creole from Cayo, captured in Peru, end quote. He was probably taken along with Miguel. Additionally, there were 3 other Spaniards that had been taken in Peru, 1 from Panama, and 6 Native Americans who may have been willing guides, or maybe not, and then a smattering of Moro women from Mindanao who may or may not have been willing concubines. That's all we have for now, although we will very soon be meeting others. And all of that brings us around to our story. When we left off last time, all of those names we just mentioned were sailing out of Mindanao Harbor, leaving Charles Swan and some 36 others behind at Mindanao. At first, the Signet stayed in the Moro Gulf, no more than 5 leagues or so out from the shoreline. You'll remember that they were low on food at this point since Raja Laut failed to produce the beef that he had promised the crew, so they were hoping to find a good hunting ground or somewhere to trade on the coast there. During that search, the crew spotted what every pirate in the world feared to see, a Spanish fortress springing into view from around a mountainside. However, they had nothing to worry about. Upon inspection, they saw that the fort was abandoned, but it still had tall, strong stone walls. The fort looked like a good place to stop. It had a good harbor and defensible positions should Raja Laut give them chase or should, say, Spanish or Dutch ships come upon them. In fact, it proved to be the perfect place to rest. There they found coconut and buffalo and hogs and sea turtles with, quote, flesh as sweet as any in the West Indies, end quote. They found fresh water, and with all of that, alongside the rice they had already, they were well provisioned for a sea voyage to wherever it was they chose to go. Now, their first destination was the Sulu Archipelago. That's a series of islands between Mindanao and Borneo that, back in 1687, was part of the Sulu Sultanate. The Sulu Sultanate stretched from eastern Borneo along this island chain to the northern shores of Mindanao. They had friendly-ish relations with the people of Mindanao, but there was a rivalry there. The archipelago, though, was home to the Moro pirates, or the Malay pirates, depending on who you're reading. The Signet was cruising on the western end of one island when, quote, here we met with 2 proas belonging to the Sulu, one of the Mindanaean nations. They came from Manila laden with silk and calico, end quote. And that's it. That's all he says about that. Maybe Signet stopped 2 proa and captured them, and they may not have. I don't know. These weren't Spanish Manila galleons, though. Manila galleons would be expected to carry things like silk and calico, but not proa. It's possible that they bought those goods in Manila, but not likely. What's much more likely is that the pirates, the English pirates I mean, hailed one of these Philippine proa, and in broken Spanish learned that they were kindred spirits, Moro pirates who had a haul of Spanish booty. Later on, in Spanish records, there would be mention made of several Malay men who were captured alongside some Spanish pirates. One of those, who spoke enough Spanish to give testimony, told a tale that contradicted his Spanish companions, but matched that of William Dampier. His name was Assam, a Philippine native who reminds me a lot of Diego Lucifer, or Diego the Mulatto, back in the West Indies. You might remember that Diego had a black mother and a white father, and due to Spain's racial system, he was severely limited in his career and lifestyle options. Assam had a Moro mother and a Spanish father, who were probably not married and might not even have been on a first-name basis. Much like Diego Lucifer, due to the constricting system of the Spanish, he chose to take his talents to sea, and he turned to piracy in the Sulu archipelago, where he sought out his revenge. Assam and his men apparently joined up with the crew of Signet here. With these Moro rovers in their ranks, they had experienced pirates who knew these waters and Spanish shipping schedules on their side. That was going to prove to be very helpful, although not in Dampier or almost any other source I can find do Assam or his Malay friends get the credit they deserved, although that might be for the best, legally speaking. As we move on into the month of February 1687, well, it was an uneventful month. The pirates cruised by an island they called the Isle of Bats, due to the bats. They were giant bats, though. They swarmed in huge numbers and blacked out the sky. Dampier says they had bodies the size of a duck's body, and they had these massive leathern wingspans of 8 feet or more. That was impressive, but not what the pirates were after. However, they did stop to careen the ship and outfit her for piracy. It had been a merchant vessel, and pirates liked their ships a certain way. Now, Captain Reed and Josiah Teat kept their cabins, which was out of the ordinary in pirate norms, but they gutted the rest of the Signet, of all of her cabins and excessive woodwork and furniture, to ensure that Signet would be as light and fast as possible. They scrubbed and tarred the hull. They repaired a bit of damage they had incurred hitting a rock a few weeks before, and they sewed sails, and they rolled ropes, and they swabbed the deck and polished the guns, and basically they ensured that everything on board was in tip-top shape. And then they set their course northward, towards Luzon, the Spanish capital there at Manila. Here at the end of February, we run into the meat of our story. But before we get to the swashbuckling piracy and the sea battles, we need to talk about historiography, dating systems, calendars, and papal history from the Middle Ages. It seems incredibly simple these days, but a large part of the reason that this other primary source with which we're about to run headlong, a large part of the reason it was considered a fabrication for so many years is because the dates given by that author do not match up with the dates given by Dampier. Many of you, I'm sure, have already figured out the problem here. So if we go back to the reign of Caius Julius Caesar, consul for life of the Roman Republic, that Julius Caesar, he was the one, the Roman leader, who proposed what's called the Julian calendar. That's what measures a year in 365 days, except every 4 years, a leap year of 366 days. That is not, although it seems so uniform today, the way that everybody throughout world history has measured a year. However, it's the basis for our modern calendar, but it's not our modern calendar. 1,600 years after Julius Caesar instituted the Julian calendar, in the year 1582, Pope Gregory XIII took action on a problem that had arisen using the Julian calendar. The calendar, astronomically speaking, didn't match up with Easter or Christmas, which is, just a thing that happens. Over time, since the Earth is always moving through the stars, The stars don't sit in our sky where they should on the days that we have all agreed mean what they mean. So Pope Gregory XIII implemented a new calendar that jumped 13 days ahead to match the current date with astronomical reality, and that is the Gregorian calendar which we use today. As you might imagine, this upset a ton of people who had to celebrate Christmas on what they saw as December the 12th. I mean, imagine it. They'd been told by priests their entire lives that Jesus was born and reborn on these days, and then they changed the dates on you. Some cultures, in fact, still hold to the Julian calendar, Anabaptists, for example, a number of Coptic sects, and parts of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which you will note, none of whom are Catholic. They didn't subscribe to this Catholic mandate. And in the early modern period, the burgeoning Protestant world weren't about to let the Pope tell them what to do either. And that included the English, who in 1687 were still using the Julian calendar. That is a very long-winded way of saying that even though the dates given by William Dampier and our other primary source didn't match, the primary reason that report was discounted, they actually represent the same day. Well, there is one day off, but that's because of the international dateline, which Dampier got wrong. Now, with all of that understood, and the fact that something really happened, we can move on to the fun stuff. Dampier writes that on the 18th of February, or the 3rd of March by Spanish Gregorian reckoning, the pirates came upon, quote, a canoe with 4 Indians came from Manila. They were very shy of us, but at last, hearing us speak Spanish, they came to us and told us that the harbor of Manila is seldom without 20 or 30 sail of vessels, most Chinese, some Portuguese, and some few the Spaniards have of their own. We told them we came to trade with the Spaniards, but this was only a pretense of ours to get out of them what intelligence we could as to their shipping, strength, and the like, under color of seeking a trade, for our business was to pillage. End quote. Despite that dramatic turn of phrase, Dampier always downplays the piracy, and he tells us very little of what's to come. But we have 2 excellent sources from which to draw. There is that other source, which I continue to dance around, and the testimony of a one Bartolome Luis, a sailor who was there on the day. Somewhere around late to mid-morning, probably near 10 a.m., the signet came upon a sampan, rowing west along the northern coast of Capones Island, just off the coast of the main island of Luzon. Now, sampan were kind of smallish, flat-bottom boats of a Chinese design that were then and still are widely used all across Southeast Asia. If you think about the boats that you might see in a Vietnam War movie, that's basically a sampan. It was, this particular sampan, a private craft that was owned by a man named Don Francisco Arzaga. Now, Signet stopped the sampan and sent men aboard to search the ship. Now, keep in mind, there wasn't a battle here. They had nothing to fight back with. The pirates just did as they chose as the tiny sampan sat under their gun battery. And on board, they found some valuable goods, spices and dyes. All of that belonged to a notable in the region, a man named Capitan Alonso de Castillo. However, the primary cargo on this sampan seemed to be Arzaga himself and his family. He and his whole family were being moved to a different command. They were being ferried on board this sampan when Signet stopped them. Now, the pirates didn't have the option of just letting them go. Arzaga and his family were witnesses, and they would certainly raise the alarm at the nearest opportunity. So they were all taken on board. The small crew of the sampan, Arzaga himself, his manservant, and what were called his women, which included probably a mother, a wife, daughters, and even babies suckling at the breast, quote unquote. Now, one might assume that a bunch of wives and daughters would be in some sort of peril among this crew of villainous pirates, but those women were interviewed, and they reported nothing but gentleness and a kind of polite, almost apologetic attitude for what they were being put through here. The pirates clearly had no intention of harming these people or probably even ransoming them. They weren't worth that much. They merely needed to keep them from raising the alarm. Now, one source says that the pirates burned the sampan, but another contradicts that. If we were to distill what they say with what Dampier tells us, I think that the pirates did burn the sampan. After all, it was evidence. You could take it with you, but you already had ship's boats. It would be better to burn it and leave it to the bottom of the sea. However, a couple of hours later, the signet came upon another ship, this one a bark, sometime in the mid-afternoon, maybe 2 p.m. Dampier writes, quote, "She was bound to Manila, but had no goods aboard, therefore we turned her away," end quote. But I don't think that Dampier was entirely truthful here. The other sources agree that the pirates on board Signet weren't interested in the cargo that was on board this Manila ship, mostly rice, but they do not agree that this bark was simply turned away. See, the pirates would have had the same problem with this bark that they had with the sampan. The bark carried witnesses who could and would raise the alarm, and a ship like that, a bark, was fairly sizable. It couldn't just be burned and disappear. It would raise a lot of smoke and take a while to burn. Now, the crew appears to have been debating whether or not to take the bark with them. They had a growing crew. They had just taken on a number of Malay pirates, and a bark would be a handy thing to have. Teat had captained the last bark belonging to the Signet, and he could do the same for this one, and I'm certain that a bunch of the people in Teat's camp were arguing for that, including Dampier and Coppinger. It would have been an escape route should that become necessary. But while the pirates were sitting there, discussing their options, with captives tied up on board and an empty ship held fast awaiting her fate, another ship arrived on the scene. Now, our anonymous source details that ship's strength. It was his ship, reportedly, so he should know. He tells us that the governor of the Philippines himself, General Don Gabriel de Huzalegui, ordered him out personally on a single-deck frigate with 25 men under his command. The purpose of that frigate was to ferry provisions back to Manila. Our source writes, quote, "Out of the royal armory I was given 4 pikes and 2 muskets for the ship's defense. But since the serpentines were broken, we needed to keep our fuses constantly lit to shoot the muskets. They also gave me 2 handfuls of bullets and 5 pounds of powder. Supplied with these arms and munitions, but without ordnance or mortars, though my vessel had ports for 6, I set sail." End quote. 2 muskets, 4 pikes, a handful of bullets, and no large guns. That is a pathetic compliment for a ship's defense by any measurement. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, everyone agrees, when that Spanish ship in question, called the Aranzazu, spotted what they, quote, assumed was one of the merchantmen from the port of Cavite, end quote. Our sources tell us that the Signet sent out 2 pirogues to approach Aranzazu. Now, were Signet a Spanish merchantman, that would have been perfectly ordinary behavior, because the Aranzazu was currently tacking against the wind and virtually unable to move. She was becalmed. A friendly Spanish ship would likely have sent over somebody to make sure everything was all right. However, as these pirogues grew near, the Spanish on board noted the muskets and the sabers that every man carried, and as they grew even closer, the Spanish realized that these weapons were not of a Spanish make. The men on board the pirogues called out to the Aranzazu in heavily accented Spanish. They said, quote, "Ahoy there! Where have you come from? Where are you sailing to?" And the captain of the Aranzazu responded warily, "From the sea." In the years to come, that exchange would be the expected question and response among pirates. That is to say, When a pirate hailed a ship and got that response that they are from the sea, the pirate is supposed to assume that the other ship are pirates as well, and therefore not to be attacked. So why did these Spaniards use that call? Maybe they were just being cautious. They didn't want to give away their port of call. Maybe they had been trained to use that response if they suspected that the ship hailing them were pirates. Or maybe, just maybe, they were from the sea. Maybe our source on board Aranzazu was lying about being provisioned by the governor in the royal armory. Maybe he and his 25 men were in fact Spanish renegados, pirates who would wind up, a few years later, wrecked on the shores of the Yucatan. No, I don't know that to be the case. It's merely a theory I have. Everybody here was lying. They were all trying to keep themselves out of prison and away from the gallows, so hard fact is a tough thing to decipher. However, I'm going to proceed as though the Aranzazu were what they claimed, merely a merchant ship ferrying goods to Manila. One of the pirates on the pirogue called their bluff here. They ordered Aranzazu to, quote, furl your sails, and the captain of Aranzazu responded, come aboard and do it yourself. That was as good an invitation as any pirates ever needed. They opened fire. The captain of Aranzazu writes, quote, I disposed my ship as best I could for defense with my 2 muskets and 4 pikes, but bullets began to rain down on us from the shotguns and muskets from the men aboard their pirogues. However, they did not immediately board us, and we answered their shots with our muskets. End quote. They probably didn't board Aranzazu because all they had were the men on their pirogues, which was likely no more than were on the frigate, somewhere in the 20 to 30 range. They could have boarded her, but it may have been a tough fight, and at the moment, the signet, the empty bark, and the Aranzazu were all essentially becalmed. It was a stalemate. The Spanish frigate was out of range of Signet's guns, but the English pirates were in between Aranzazu and shore. Even more, the pirogues had oars. They could circle all around Aranzazu and fire anywhere they chose to from all directions. There was no escape for the Spanish here unless, maybe, the wind picked up in her favor. One account says that the fighting went on for 2 hours, another for 3 hours. But really it wasn't much of a fight, it was more harassment here. The Spanish on board Aranzazu had 2 muskets, that's virtually nothing. Even if the pirates did board her, they had almost no steel on board and only 25 sailors. And all of our Spanish sources wax poetic about a brave resistance here, but really? And I don't intend to demean Spanish bravery here. More than once in our show we have seen an outnumbered and underarmed group of brave Spanish soldiers hold back an overwhelming pirate force. But I mean, come on here. 25 sailors, and these were errand boys, not soldiers here, and they had 2 muskets? To think of them resisting is such a ludicrous thought that, well, I will humor them here. I'll finish their story. After 3 hours of fierce fighting, the Signet was able to draw close once the wind picked up, with her 18 big guns and 80 or so deadly pirates aboard. Aranzazu tried to tack away from the fight, but the pirogues kept her pilot from the helm. The devilish captain of perfidious Albion called out to Aranzazu to, quote, ease their sheets. But the Spanish would not comply. They put up a brave resistance at the rail. They cut down grappling hooks and stood firm with pikes in hand. And as everyone knows, those filthy English Protestants are all cowards at heart. It looked like they might prevail in the face of great odds, but in the end, after many grievous wounds taken, the heathen barbarians overwhelmed the deck and captured Aranzazu. Now, Dampier doesn't contradict that. His account of this dashing sea battle reads, quote, we took another vessel that came from the same place. She was laden with rice and cotton, also bound for Manila. Those goods were purposely for the Acapulco ship. The rice was for the men, and the cotton cloth for sale." End quote. And, yeah, that's it. I mean, imagine that you were Dampier's publishers here. This is the first capture that you've had to talk about for some time now. Wouldn't you want to sex it up a bit? Give us some fire and blood, Dampier. Give us something to work with. But I doubt there really was much fire or blood. There was at least one volley, verifiably, because one Spaniard was injured in the fighting. That volley might even have been a warning volley. I suspect that the battle lasted less than half an hour, probably significantly less. The Spanish, more than likely, capitulated very quickly and struck sail. If it was just a warning shot, I don't think we could blame the Spanish here. It would have been incredibly stupid to put up a serious fight. All that would have gained would be death and destruction. As undermanned and underarmed as you are, you surrender. However, imagine that you were writing a confession, years later, to absolve yourself of any guilt you might carry in some upcoming piracies. You would absolutely say that you fought with your life to keep these pirates from taking your ship. Regardless of all that, somewhere between 6 and 7 p.m. on the 4th of March, 1687, by modern reckoning, Aranzazu was in the hands of the English pirates of the Signet. I enjoy these tales of long work days for the pirates. Once they get their ships up to par, they sail into major shipping lanes and capture 2 or 3 or 5 ships in a day, sometimes more. Usually they're not ships of much consequence, but they're fun stories. However, what comes after they capture those ships is even more fascinating still. Next time, we're going to talk about what happened on board Signet and Aranzazu and that bark. Now, that story is disputed on all sides, and it's filled with even more lies than today's tale. However, we're going to finally meet our anonymous chronicler and explore who he actually was, and hopefully find the truth. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has donated to the show through the website, everybody who has left us a rating or a review wherever it is you listen, everybody who has recommended this show. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to do this. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Bred. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's BRILLIG.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.